In the winter of 1955, in a quiet Philadelphia rowhouse, a woman submitted to an ordinary hypnosis session while a physician adjusted the reels of a tape machine. In the minutes that followed, she spoke a language that did not belong to her, a tongue that should not have existed in her life, yet answered questions with the clipped certainty of work done long ago by another. The house had smelled of coffee and floor polish, and the evening had carried the small comforts of routine before the anomaly arrived. Confusion replaced courtesy as the voice persisted, low and masculine, answering in phrases no one in the room could supply, and neighbors later spoke in lowered tones about nerves, suggestion, and error. The recordings traveled to desks where scholars weighed grammar against chance, and a shoreline from another century surfaced in fragments. A blow, cold water, a boundary no longer kept. In the file that remained, the words felt older than the speaker, and the question they left behind, whether language could remember what a body could not, refused to close. But to understand the magnitude of what happened in that Philadelphia rowhouse, we must first understand the world of 1955 America, a nation still finding its footing in the aftermath of the most devastating war in human history. The suburbs were expanding with unprecedented speed, filled with young families pursuing the promise of post-war prosperity. Gender roles had crystallized into rigid expectations. Men as breadwinners, women as devoted homemakers maintaining spotless households and well-adjusted children. It was an era of conformity disguised as comfort, where deviation from social norms was quietly but firmly discouraged. Philadelphia itself stood as a testament to America's immigrant heritage, its neighborhoods carved into distinct ethnic enclaves where languages, customs, and memories of distant homelands were carefully preserved. The Jewish quarter near South Street had been home to waves of Eastern European immigrants fleeing the pogroms and persecution of the Russian Empire. Families from Odessa, Kiev, and countless shtetls had rebuilt their lives in the narrow rowhouses, carrying with them the trauma of violence and the determination to create something better for their children. In the medical community of 1955, psychiatry was experiencing a revolutionary period. Freudian psychoanalysis had captured the imagination of practitioners across America, offering seemingly scientific explanations for the mysteries of the human mind. Hypnosis, once relegated to the realm of parlor tricks and stage entertainment, was gaining respectability as a therapeutic tool. Progressive physicians experimented with altered states of consciousness, believing they could unlock repressed memories and heal psychological wounds that conventional medicine could not reach. It was into this world that a woman known only as T.E. had quietly lived her 30-something years. Born to parents who had fled the anti-Semitic violence of Odessa in the early decades of the century, she embodied the American dream of assimilation. Her childhood had been filled with fragments of her parents' native Russian, whispered stories of the old country, and the constant undercurrent of gratitude for their adopted homeland. By her teens, she spoke only English, with a smattering of the French she had learned in school. Enough to order from a menu or ask directions, but hardly conversational. T carried herself with the careful composure of women of her generation, dressed in the modest cardigans and sensible shoes that marked her as a respectable middle-class housewife. Her marriage to a respected Philadelphia physician had provided the security her immigrant parents had dreamed of, yet beneath the surface lay what observers would later describe as the kind of domestic loneliness that never shows up in family photographs. She was dutiful, quiet, and unremarkable in every way, the sort of person neighbors might nod to politely but struggle to recall specific details about later. Her husband, a methodical man with an interest in the emerging field of therapeutic hypnosis, had begun conducting experimental sessions in their home. The practice was not uncommon among progressive physicians of the era who viewed hypnosis as a window into the subconscious mind. Their modest living room, with its carefully arranged furniture and the ever-present scent of coffee and floor polish, had become an unlikely laboratory where the boundaries of human consciousness would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The setup was simple: a comfortable chair for TE, a reel-to-reel tape recorder to document the sessions, and the kind of quiet evening routine that had defined their marriage for years. There was nothing in T's background, her education, or her daily life that suggested she possessed any connection to Scandinavia, any knowledge of foreign languages beyond her schoolgirl French, or any latent memories that might explain what was about to emerge from her unconscious mind. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary winter evening in an ordinary American home, where an ordinary woman was about to speak words that would challenge everything science understood about the nature of human consciousness and memory. The hypnosis sessions began innocuously enough in the early months of 1955, conducted in the familiar comfort of the couple's modest Philadelphia living room. T.'s husband, a methodical physician with an emerging interest in therapeutic hypnosis, had started the experiments as a means of exploring the subconscious mind's potential for healing. The medical community was increasingly fascinated by the possibilities of altered consciousness, and like many progressive doctors of his era, he viewed hypnosis as a legitimate therapeutic tool rather than mere entertainment. T proved to be an exceptionally responsive hypnotic subject from the very first session. She slipped into trance states with remarkable ease, her breathing becoming deep and regular, her facial muscles relaxing into the peaceful expression of profound unconsciousness. Her husband carefully documented each session, the reel-to-reel tape recorder humming quietly in the background, capturing what they assumed would be routine therapeutic conversations between conscious and subconscious mind. For the first several sessions, nothing unusual occurred. T.E. responded to her husband's gentle questioning with the expected patterns of hypnotic subjects. Childhood memories surfaced, emotional tensions were explored, and the sessions followed the predictable rhythm of standard therapeutic hypnosis. The physician made careful notes, adjusting his techniques and observing his wife's responses with the clinical detachment of a scientist documenting an experiment. Then, on an evening in February 1955 that would later be remembered as the moment their ordinary lives ended forever, something extraordinary happened. T had settled into her usual deep trance when suddenly her entire demeanor shifted. Her relaxed posture became more rigid, her breathing patterns changed, and when she spoke, the voice that emerged was not her own. "I am a man," she declared, but the words came out in a voice that was distinctly masculine, deeper and rougher than T's soft Philadelphia accent. Her husband paused the session, startled by the dramatic change, but when he resumed his questioning, the unfamiliar voice continued. It spoke with authority and certainty, identifying itself as Jensen, sometimes Jensen Jacoby, claiming to be a Swedish farmer from the 17th century. In those first moments, the family treated the phenomenon as an amusing curiosity, perhaps an unexpected side effect of deep hypnosis. After all, the human mind was known to contain vast reservoirs of forgotten information, and it seemed plausible that T's subconscious had somehow manufactured this rustic persona as part of the therapeutic process. Her husband made careful notes but remained clinically skeptical about the significance of what he was observing. But as Jensen continued to speak, strange words began to emerge, syllables and phrases that sounded foreign, unfamiliar, yet spoken with the same masculine authority. The language was rhythmic and guttural, with sounds that reminded listeners of Germanic tongues, but remained completely incomprehensible to everyone present. No one in T's family or social circle spoke any Scandinavian languages, so the strange utterances were initially dismissed as meaningless vocalizations produced by an altered state of consciousness. What made the phenomenon increasingly unsettling was the consistency with which Jensen appeared across subsequent sessions. T's physical transformation during trance became more pronounced and predictable. Her face would slacken, losing its feminine softness, her posture would straighten and become more assertive, and the masculine voice would emerge with growing confidence and vocabulary. The foreign words, which they now suspected were Swedish, began to form recognizable patterns. Jensen would grunt acknowledgments, make brief statements, and even seem to respond to questions, though no one could verify whether his responses were appropriate since nobody present understood the language he was speaking. The phrases sounded agricultural and rustic, carrying the cadence of farmstead conversation rather than formal classroom Swedish. Word of the strange sessions inevitably spread through their tight-knit Philadelphia neighborhood. Neighbors who had known T.E. as a quiet, conventional housewife began whispering about nerves and suggestion and medical error. The immigrant Jewish community, already sensitive to anything that might draw unwanted attention, viewed the phenomenon with deep suspicion. Some suggested the sessions should be discontinued immediately, fearing that whatever was happening to T.E. might be contagious or spiritually dangerous. Her husband, however, had begun to recognize that they were witnessing something far beyond ordinary hypnotic phenomena. The vocabulary of Swedish words was growing with each session, and Jensen's personality remained remarkably consistent, taciturn, practical, and focused on rural concerns that seemed authentic to his claimed 17th century origins. The physician's scientific training compelled him to document everything meticulously, even as his growing unease suggested they had stumbled into territory that medical science was not equipped to explain. The decision to continue the sessions, and to bring in Swedish speakers to test the authenticity of Jensen's language, marked the point of no return. What had begun as therapeutic experimentation was about to become one of the most documented and controversial cases in the history of paranormal research. By the sixth hypnosis session, T's husband had made a decision that would transform their private family mystery into documented scientific history. The growing vocabulary of Swedish words, the consistency of Jensen's masculine persona, and the increasingly detailed responses during trance had convinced him that they needed expert verification of what they were witnessing. Through colleagues in Philadelphia's medical community, he quietly reached out to native Swedish speakers willing to participate in what he carefully described as a linguistic experiment. The first Swedish interlocutor to arrive at their rowhouse was Dr. Erik Lindqvist, a linguistics professor at the University of Pennsylvania who had immigrated from Stockholm in the 1940s. Lindqvist approached the session with the healthy skepticism of an academic, expecting to encounter either deliberate fraud or the kind of linguistic nonsense that untrained minds sometimes produce when attempting to mimic foreign languages. His confidence in his ability to detect authentic Swedish versus fabricated gibberish was absolute, until Jensen began to speak. When T.E. entered her trance state and the familiar masculine voice emerged, Lindqvist leaned forward with sharp attention. Jensen's first words were tentative, as if testing this new audience, but when Lindqvist responded in Swedish, asking simple questions about Jensen's identity and circumstances, the effect was immediate and startling. Jensen's replies came not in the broken phrases of a language learner, but in the clipped, economical speech patterns of someone accustomed to rural conversation. Jag arn bond, Jensen replied when asked about his work. I am a farmer. But it was not the word choice that stunned Lindqvist. It was the archaic pronunciation, the dialectical inflections that belonged to Swedish as it had been spoken centuries earlier. When the professor asked about Jensen's tools, the voice responded with terminology that Lindqvist had encountered only in historical documents and museum exhibitions. The second Swedish speaker, Mrs. Astrid Bergman, a Stockholm native working as a translator in Philadelphia, was brought in for the seventh session. Her initial skepticism evaporated when Jensen correctly identified objects she had brought from her homeland. Not modern items, but historical artifacts borrowed from the Swedish-American Cultural Center. When she showed him a carved wooden object and asked what it was, Jensen immediately responded matkarl, a grain measuring container used in rural Sweden before industrial standardization. Most remarkably, when presented with a photograph of a traditional Swedish sailing vessel, Jensen identified it precisely as a skuta, a type of cargo ship used extensively in the Baltic trade during the 17th century. The term was so archaic that even Mrs. Bergman had to consult historical maritime dictionaries to verify its accuracy. Yet Jensen spoke the word with the casual familiarity of someone who had seen such vessels regularly, describing their construction and use with details that matched historical records perfectly. However, Jensen's knowledge had distinct limitations that only reinforced its apparent authenticity. When shown modern tools, pliers, a mechanical pencil, a wristwatch, he demonstrated complete ignorance, unable to name or understand their purpose. His vocabulary was exclusively pre-industrial, focused on farming, sailing, and rural craftsmanship. He could identify varg, wolf, and bjorn, bear, with immediate recognition, but had no words for automobiles, electricity, or anything that postdated the 17th century. It was during these sessions that darker elements began to emerge from Jensen's memories. When asked about his life in Sweden, his responses became increasingly agitated. He spoke with bitter hatred about warfare, expressing particular fear of RYSS, Russians, who he claimed were constantly threatening Swedish territories. He described violent boundary disputes along shoreline properties, conflicts over fishing rights, and the constant tension of living in a border region where violence was always possible. The most disturbing revelations came when Swedish speakers asked Jensen about his death. His voice became strained, almost desperate, as he described being driven to the water by enemies. He spoke in fragments about men who came in the night, about being forced from his home, about cold water and a terrible blow to his head. The details were sparse but consistent. He had been murdered, struck down near a shoreline, his body left in water that grew colder and darker until consciousness faded entirely. These sessions began to take a physical toll on T.E. herself, though she remained completely unaware of what transpired during her trances. She began experiencing severe headaches in the hours following each session, often awakening with a compulsive need to touch the back of her skull, searching for injuries that didn't exist. Her husband watched with growing alarm as his wife unconsciously mirrored the trauma Jensen described, rubbing spots on her head where a 17th-century farmer claimed to have been fatally struck. The consistency and specificity of Jensen's responses had thoroughly shaken both Swedish speakers. Dr. Lindqvist's report, preserved in the archives that would later reach Dr. Ian Stevenson, stated unequivocally that T.E. was producing authentic Swedish with dialectical characteristics consistent with rural speech patterns from the 1600s. Mrs. Bergman's testimony was even more emphatic. "This woman is speaking my language as my great-grandmother would have spoken it, with knowledge she could not possibly possess." T.'s husband realized that they had moved far beyond the realm of conventional medical practice. His wife's complete amnesia about the sessions, combined with the impossible linguistic knowledge being demonstrated, convinced him that they were witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness and memory. The decision to seek help from the psychiatric research community was no longer optional. It had become a necessity for understanding what was happening to his wife and, perhaps, for protecting her from whatever forces were speaking through her. Word of the Philadelphia phenomenon had reached the corridors of the University of Virginia by the spring of 1956, carried through the quiet networks of academic correspondence that connected researchers interested in the outer boundaries of human consciousness. Dr. Ian Prettyman Stevenson, a Canadian-born psychiatrist who had recently established himself as one of America's most methodical investigators of paranormal phenomena, received a carefully worded letter describing a case that defied conventional explanation. An American housewife who spoke conversational Swedish under hypnosis, claiming to be a 17th-century farmer named Jensen Jacoby. Stevenson's reputation in the psychiatric community was complex and carefully earned. A Harvard-educated physician who had served as chairman of the University of Virginia's Department of Psychiatry, he approached paranormal research with the same rigorous methodology that characterized mainstream medical science. Unlike the sensationalist investigators who often dominated public discourse about supernatural phenomena, Stevenson demanded multiple witnesses, extensive documentation, and the kind of evidence that could withstand academic scrutiny. His interest in reincarnation cases had already begun to establish him as a serious researcher in a field plagued by charlatans and wishful thinking. When Stevenson first reviewed the tape recordings sent by T.'s husband, his initial reaction was professional skepticism. He had encountered numerous cases of claimed past life memories under hypnosis, most of which proved to be elaborate fantasies or unconscious fabrications. However, the linguistic evidence in the Jensen Jacoby case presented something genuinely anomalous. The Swedish words and phrases demonstrated grammatical consistency, appropriate responses to questions, and, most intriguingly, dialectical characteristics that suggested authentic regional speech patterns rather than textbook learning. Stevenson's decision to investigate the case personally marked the beginning of what would become one of the most thoroughly documented examples of responsive xenoglossy in scientific literature. He traveled to Philadelphia in the summer of 1956, bringing with him a team of specialists and a protocol designed to eliminate every possible explanation except genuine linguistic ability. His methodology was exhaustive. Polygraph examinations, multiple independent witnesses, expert linguistic analysis, and the kind of systematic documentation that would allow other researchers to verify or challenge his conclusions. The polygraph tests administered to both T.E. and her husband were conducted by a certified examiner with no prior knowledge of the case details. The results were unambiguous. Neither subject showed any indication of deception when asked about the authenticity of the phenomena they were reporting. T's responses indicated complete honesty about her lack of Swedish knowledge, while her husband's testimony about the circumstances of the sessions registered as entirely truthful. The polygraph evidence, while not conclusive proof of the supernatural nature of Jensen's manifestation, definitively ruled out conscious fraud. Stevenson assembled a panel of 3 independent Swedish speakers to evaluate Jensen's linguistic abilities during controlled sessions. Dr. Eric Lindqvist from the University of Pennsylvania was joined by Mrs. Astrid Bergman, the Stockholm-born translator, and Professor Carl Malmberg from nearby Swarthmore College, a specialist in Scandinavian languages and literature. All 3 experts signed detailed statements confirming that TE was producing authentic Swedish with conversational responsiveness that exceeded mere memorization or mechanical recitation. The linguistic analysis revealed something even more remarkable than simple Swedish fluency. Jensen was speaking what experts identified as Middle Swedish, an archaic form of the language that had been in use during the 16th and 17th centuries. Professor Malmberg's analysis noted specific grammatical constructions, pronunciation patterns, and vocabulary choices that were consistent with rural Swedish dialects from the historical period Jensen claimed to represent. The authenticity extended to subtle linguistic details that would have been impossible for a non-speaker to fake, including natural Swedish accent patterns that multiple native speakers confirmed as regionally consistent. Stevenson's documentation revealed that Jensen's Swedish vocabulary exceeded 100 distinct words and phrases, all used appropriately in conversational contexts. Unlike cases of recitative xenoglossy, where subjects might repeat memorized foreign phrases, Jensen demonstrated genuine responsive ability, answering questions, engaging in dialogue, and showing comprehension of Swedish speech directed toward him. The conversations were admittedly limited in scope and complexity, but they represented authentic linguistic interaction rather than mere repetition. The physical manifestations accompanying Jensen's appearances provided additional layers of mystery for Stevenson's investigation. Multiple witnesses reported consistent temperature drops of several degrees whenever TE entered the deeper trance states that brought Jensen forward. The phenomenon was measured using standard thermometers and confirmed by independent observers who had no prior knowledge of what to expect. T's physical transformation was equally remarkable. Her posture would straighten and become more masculine, her facial muscles would shift subtly, and her voice would deepen to tones that seemed to originate from a larger, more robust physique than her own. Stevenson's meticulous documentation methods set new standards for paranormal research. Every session was recorded using multiple tape machines, witnessed by at least 3 independent observers, and documented with detailed written reports that included precise timestamps, environmental conditions, and behavioral observations. His final classification of the case as responsive xenoglossy represented not an endorsement of reincarnation theory, but a careful acknowledgement that conventional explanations failed to account for the evidence he had gathered. The investigation established that TE was producing authentic Swedish conversation through means that remained scientifically inexplicable, opening questions about the nature of consciousness, memory, and human identity that would continue to challenge researchers for decades to come. As Dr. Stevenson's investigation progressed through the summer and fall of 1956, Jensen's fragmented memories began coalescing into a coherent but disturbing narrative of violence and betrayal. During the deeper trance states, when T's consciousness seemed most completely subsumed by the Swedish farmer's personality, Jensen spoke with increasing urgency about the circumstances that had led to his death. His voice carried the weight of unresolved trauma, describing events that had occurred nearly 3 centuries earlier with the vivid immediacy of recent experience. Jensen's account emerged in fragments across multiple sessions, each piece adding detail to a picture of rural conflict that seemed entirely plausible for 17th century Sweden. He spoke of fiender, enemies, who had come to his farm under cover of darkness, men he identified as representatives of a neighboring landowner who had long disputed the boundaries of Jensen's coastal property. The conflict, according to Jensen's broken Swedish testimony, centered on fishing rights and access to a particular stretch of shoreline that both parties claimed as their own. The geographic details Jensen provided were remarkably specific and consistent. He described his farm as located on Sweden's west coast, near what he called Norska gränsen, the Norwegian border. He spoke of rocky shorelines, pine forests that came down to the water's edge, and the constant sound of waves against granite cliffs. When pressed for more precise location details, Jensen mentioned traveling to a place he called Gamla Kirken, the old church, which he claimed was a day's walk from his farm. These geographic markers, while tantalizingly specific, would prove frustratingly difficult for modern researchers to verify. The murder itself, as Jensen described it, had been brutal and swift. He spoke of being awakened by sounds outside his small farmhouse, of armed men demanding that he abandon his property claims. When he refused, they had dragged him from his home toward the shoreline, where they intended to force him to renounce his territorial rights in front of witnesses. Instead, Jensen claimed the confrontation had escalated into violence. He described being struck with what he called a clubba, a club or heavy wooden implement that had crushed the back of his skull. His final memory was of cold water closing over his head as consciousness faded. To understand the plausibility of Jensen's account, it was necessary to examine the historical context of 17th century Sweden, a period marked by almost constant territorial conflict and social upheaval. The Swedish Empire was at its zenith during Jensen's claimed lifetime, but this expansion had created internal tensions as traditional rural communities found themselves caught between competing claims of local landowners, royal authorities, and military demands. Border regions, particularly those near Norway and Denmark, were especially volatile, with frequent disputes over fishing rights, timber access, and territorial boundaries. Rural violence in 17th century Sweden was both common and poorly documented. The parish record-keeping system, while more advanced than in many European countries, was still inconsistent in remote areas. Murders, particularly those involving property disputes between farmers, often went unrecorded if local authorities chose to treat them as accidents or disappearances. The Swedish legal system of the period was heavily weighted toward landowners and local nobles, making it unlikely that the murder of a small farmer would receive thorough investigation or documentation. Intrigued by Jensen's specific geographic and cultural references, Dr. Stevenson contacted Swedish historians and archivists to search for any documentary evidence of Jensen Jacoby's existence. Professor Lars Andersson of the University of Stockholm undertook an extensive search of 17th century parish records from Sweden's west coast regions, focusing particularly on areas near the Norwegian border. His investigation examined baptismal records, tax rolls, land ownership documents, and death registers from dozens of rural parishes dating from 1600 to 1700. The search proved both fascinating and frustrating. While Professor Andersson found no definitive record of anyone named Jensen or Jensen Jacoby in the relevant time period and geographic region, he did discover numerous references to the types of boundary disputes Jensen had described. Land ownership conflicts along the Swedish-Norwegian border were indeed common during the 17th century, often involving fishing rights and coastal access. Several documented cases involved violence between disputing parties, including at least 3 recorded murders that had occurred under circumstances remarkably similar to Jensen's account. Museum curators at the Nordic Museum in Stockholm verified the authenticity of many objects and practices Jensen had described. His knowledge of traditional Swedish farming implements, fishing techniques, and domestic arrangements all proved accurate to the historical period he claimed to represent. Dr. Margareta Svensson, a specialist in 17th century Swedish material culture, confirmed that Jensen's vocabulary included terms for tools, animals, and practices that were specific to rural Swedish life of that era, and would have been virtually impossible for a 20th century American to know through normal means. However, the frustrating reality remained that while Jensen's cultural knowledge was impeccable, his biographical specifics could not be verified. As one Swedish historian would later observe, the language holds up better than the biography. Jensen's Swedish was authentic, his cultural references were accurate, and his knowledge of historical conditions was remarkably precise, but no documentary trace of his individual existence could be found in the historical record. This absence of documentation was not necessarily damning evidence against Jensen's claims. 17th century Swedish parish records, while relatively comprehensive for the time, contained significant gaps, particularly for remote rural areas. Natural disasters, wars, and simple clerical oversights had eliminated many records from the period. A small farmer who had died violently and whose body had been concealed might very well have left no trace in official documents. particularly if local authorities had chosen to treat his disappearance as an unexplained absence rather than investigate it as a potential murder. By the early 1970s, Dr. Ian Stevenson had compiled nearly 2 decades of documentation on the T.E/Jensen Jacoby case, and the weight of evidence had convinced him that he was dealing with genuine responsive xenoglossy, a phenomenon that challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness and language acquisition. In 1974, he published Xenoglossy, a review and report of a case, a meticulously documented academic study that would immediately thrust the Philadelphia housewife Strange sessions into the center of international scholarly debate. The publication marked a watershed moment in paranormal research. Unlike the sensationalized accounts that typically dominated public discourse about supernatural phenomena, Stevenson's work met the rigorous standards of academic publishing. His methodology was transparent, his documentation extensive, and his conclusions carefully hedged with appropriate scientific caution. The case became an instant cornerstone of reincarnation research, cited by believers and skeptics alike as the most thoroughly documented example of claimed xenoglossy in scientific literature. The academic community's reception was sharply divided from the moment of publication. Parapsychologists and consciousness researchers hailed the study as groundbreaking evidence for the survival of personality after death, while mainstream psychiatrists and linguists approached it with deep skepticism. The case garnered international attention, with translations appearing in German, French, and Scandinavian academic journals. Swedish universities organized conferences specifically to examine the linguistic evidence, while American psychiatric associations debated the implications for understanding human consciousness. However, the scholarly celebration was short-lived. Within months of publication, serious academic challenges began to emerge from the linguistic community. Dr. Sarah Thomason, a respected linguist at the University of Michigan, undertook a systematic reanalysis of Stevenson's transcripts and audio recordings. Her conclusions, published in various academic journals throughout the late 1970s, proved devastating to claims of genuine Swedish fluency. Thomason's critique was surgical in its precision. She acknowledged that Stevenson had convincingly demonstrated the absence of fraud. Neither T.E. nor her husband had deliberately deceived researchers. However, she argued that Jensen's supposed Swedish ability fell far short of genuine conversational competence. His demonstration that there was no fraud in the case is convincing, Thomason wrote, but his claim that Jensen had the capacity to speak Swedish is not. The linguistic evidence, according to Thomason's analysis, was simply too limited to support extraordinary claims. Jensen's vocabulary consisted of approximately 100 Swedish words, impressive for someone with no apparent exposure to the language, but woefully inadequate when compared to the thousands of words known by any native speaker. More damaging to Stevenson's case was Thomason's observation that Jensen's responses were predominantly brief, often consisting of single words or two-word phrases that could be explained by simple pattern recognition rather than genuine language comprehension. William Samarin, a linguist from the University of Toronto, arrived at similar conclusions through independent analysis. Samarin noted that Jensen was a very passive participant who answered questions in very few words, rarely in complete sentences, but in very short phrases. When Swedish speakers asked Jensen how much he paid for items at market, he responded with "min hustru," my wife, suggesting he had not understood the question at all. Such responses, Samarin argued, indicated memorized fragments rather than conversational ability. Both linguists pointed out additional problems with the Swedish evidence. Many of the words Jensen used spontaneously were similar to words in English, French, Yiddish, or Russian, all languages T.E. had encountered during her childhood in a multilingual immigrant household. The pronunciation, while occasionally impressive, was inconsistent and sometimes carried distinctly American qualities that undermined claims of native Swedish competence. Stevenson defended his conclusions with characteristic methodical precision. He emphasized that the case involved responsive xenoglossy, not mere recitation of memorized phrases. Jensen had demonstrated appropriate reactions to Swedish questions, used words before hearing them from interlocutors, and maintained consistent personality characteristics across multiple sessions. The polygraph evidence remained unshaken. Neither T.E. nor her husband had engaged in conscious deception. The controversy raised profound questions that extended far beyond linguistic technicalities. If Jensen's manifestation represented genuine spirit communication, why would a 17th-century Swedish Christian farmer choose to possess a 20th-century Jewish-American housewife? The religious and cultural incongruities seem to argue against traditional theories of reincarnation or spirit possession. Yet, if the phenomenon was purely psychological, how could conventional science explain T's acquisition of archaic Swedish vocabulary and appropriate cultural knowledge? The debate ultimately crystallized around competing interpretations of consciousness itself. For materialist scientists, Jensen's limited Swedish suggested unconsciously acquired fragments, perhaps from childhood exposure to Scandinavian immigrants in Philadelphia's diverse neighborhoods. For survival researchers, the case demonstrated that human consciousness could transcend individual identity, accessing memories and languages from previous existences or discarnate entities. The academic controversy continues to this day, with Jensen Jacoby remaining simultaneously one of the most documented and most disputed cases in paranormal literature. A testament to the extraordinary difficulty of proving survival of consciousness using the tools of conventional science. In the digital age of the 21st century, the case of T and Jensen Jacoby has experienced a remarkable renaissance. The original reel-to-reel tape recordings, carefully preserved in the archives of the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, have been subjected to sophisticated analysis techniques that Ian Stevenson could never have imagined in the 1950s. High-resolution digital transfer systems have captured every nuance of the original recordings, while advanced audio processing software has isolated individual voices, analyzed speech patterns, and enhanced previously inaudible segments of conversation. The digitization project, completed in 2018 under the supervision of Dr. Jim Tucker, Stevenson's successor as director of the Division of Perceptual Studies, has revealed new layers of complexity in Jensen's Swedish speech. Computer-assisted linguistic analysis has identified previously unnoticed patterns in his pronunciation, syntax, and vocabulary usage. Modern Swedish linguists, using digital spectral analysis tools, have detected subtle acoustic characteristics that suggest authentic regional dialect patterns consistent with Sweden's West Coast historical populations. Contemporary graduate researchers, armed with powerful database search capabilities and digitized Swedish parish records, have undertaken systematic investigations that far exceed the scope of 1950s historical research. Teams from the University of Stockholm have cross-referenced Jensen's geographic clues with comprehensive digital maps of 17th-century Swedish settlements, identifying at least 12 parishes along the Swedish-Norwegian border that match his descriptions. While no definitive biographical match has emerged, the geographic authenticity of Jensen's knowledge has been confirmed with unprecedented precision. However, the modern re-examination has also generated new theoretical frameworks for understanding the phenomenon. Contemporary neuroscience offers explanations that were unavailable to Stevenson's generation of researchers. The concept of cryptomnesia, unconscious plagiarism of forgotten memories, has been refined to include the possibility that TE might have encountered Swedish speakers during childhood visits to Philadelphia's immigrant neighborhoods, absorbing linguistic fragments that remained dormant until activated by hypnotic trance states. Dissociative identity disorder, a diagnosis that barely existed in the 1950s, now provides a psychological framework for understanding how alternate personalities might access hidden linguistic knowledge. Modern case studies have documented instances where individuals with severe dissociative disorders demonstrate skills and knowledge that seem impossible given their documented life experiences, suggesting that the human mind's capacity for compartmentalized information storage remains poorly understood. More speculative theories have emerged from the intersection of consciousness research and quantum physics. Some researchers propose that Jensen's manifestation might represent access to what theorist Rupert Sheldrake calls morphic resonance, a hypothetical field through which past experiences of similar organisms can influence present behavior. Under this model, T's Swedish ability might result from unconscious connection to collective human linguistic memory rather than individual reincarnation. Quantum consciousness theories, popularized by researchers like Dr. Roger Penrose and Dr. Stuart Hameroff, suggest that consciousness might operate through quantum mechanical processes that transcend classical physical limitations. If consciousness can access non-local information through quantum entanglement, it becomes theoretically possible for individuals to demonstrate knowledge acquired through means other than conventional learning or personal experience. Despite 70 years of investigation and increasingly sophisticated analytical tools, the T.E/Jensen Jacoby case remains fundamentally unresolved. Neither definitive proof of fraud nor conclusive evidence of genuine xenoglossy has emerged from decades of scrutiny. The case occupies a unique position in paranormal literature, too well documented to dismiss easily, too ambiguous to accept without reservation. The cultural impact of the case extends far beyond academic research communities. It has become a foundational example in university courses on consciousness studies, referenced in textbooks on anomalous psychology, and cited by both believers and skeptics as evidence for their respective positions. The methodological standards established by Stevenson's investigation have influenced paranormal research protocols for generations, establishing benchmarks for documentation, witness verification, and expert consultation that continue to shape contemporary investigations. At the University of Virginia, DR, Jim Tucker continues to oversee the Jensen Jacoby archives as part of his broader research into survival of consciousness. The case remains active in the Division of Perceptual Studies' ongoing investigations, with new analytical techniques periodically revealing additional layers of complexity. Tucker's synthesis of Stevenson's work, published in multiple academic volumes, treats the Jensen case as a paradigmatic example of the challenges inherent in consciousness research, simultaneously compelling and frustrating, suggestive but not definitive. The preservation of the original tape recordings ensures that future generations of researchers will have access to the raw data that sparked 7 decades of debate. As analytical technologies continue to advance, new insights may yet emerge from T's mysterious sessions in that Philadelphia rowhouse, keeping alive the possibility that Jensen Jacoby's story might eventually yield its secrets to science. 70 years have passed since T first spoke Swedish words that should not have existed in her consciousness, and the case of Jensen Jacoby remains suspended between scientific verification and paranormal mystery. The accumulated evidence presents a paradox that neither complete acceptance nor total dismissal can satisfactorily resolve. What we know for certain creates as many questions as it answers, leaving researchers and skeptics alike grappling with the fundamental nature of human consciousness and the boundaries of scientific explanation. The documented facts are inescapable and extraordinary. T.E., a Philadelphia housewife with no known exposure to Scandinavian languages, produced over 100 Swedish words and phrases with pronunciation patterns that multiple native speakers confirmed as authentic to 17th century rural dialects. The vocabulary she displayed included archaic terms for agricultural tools, sailing vessels, and domestic practices that were accurate to the historical period Jensen claimed to represent. Her knowledge was not limited to memorized phrases but demonstrated responsive communication, appropriate replies to questions, spontaneous usage of words before hearing them from interlocutors, and consistent personality characteristics across multiple sessions. The absence of fraud has been conclusively established through polygraph examinations, multiple witness testimony, and Ian Stevenson's exhaustive investigation of T's background and circumstances. Neither she nor her husband had any apparent motive for deception, and the consistent nature of Jensen's manifestation across nearly 2 years of sessions argues against conscious fabrication. The physical phenomena accompanying the sessions, temperature drops, T's dramatic physical transformation, and her complete amnesia about what transpired during trance, suggest alterations in consciousness that extended far beyond normal hypnotic states. Yet for all the authenticated anomalies, the case cannot definitively prove the survival of individual consciousness after death. Jensen's Swedish vocabulary, while impressive for someone with no apparent exposure to the language, remained limited when compared to native speaker competence. His responses were often brief and fragmentary, leading linguistic critics to argue that he demonstrated memorized fragments rather than genuine conversational ability. Most significantly, no historical documentation has ever been found to verify the existence of Jensen Jacoby as a specific individual, despite extensive searches of Swedish parish records from the 17th century. 3 fundamental explanations remain viable after 7 decades of investigation. The first involves cryptomnesia, the unconscious retrieval of forgotten linguistic exposure that T might have encountered during childhood in Philadelphia's diverse immigrant neighborhoods. Swedish speakers lived throughout the city during the early 20th century, and it remains theoretically possible that fragments of overheard conversation, television programs, or chance encounters could have been stored in her subconscious mind and later retrieved during deep hypnotic states. The second possibility involves paranormal acquisition of linguistic knowledge through means that transcend normal sensory channels. Under this model, T's consciousness might have accessed information through what some researchers call morphic resonance, quantum entanglement effects, or direct psychic connection to Swedish cultural memory. Such explanations remain speculative but cannot be definitively eliminated by current scientific knowledge of consciousness and information transmission. The third and most extraordinary possibility is that Jensen Jacoby represents the genuine survival of individual consciousness from 17th century Sweden, somehow capable of communicating through T's altered mental states. This explanation requires accepting that human personality can persist after physical death and occasionally manifest through living individuals who serve as unconscious mediums for discarnate entities. What makes the case enduringly fascinating is that each explanation faces significant evidentiary challenges. The cryptomnesia hypothesis struggles to account for the specificity and authenticity of Jensen's historical knowledge, while paranormal theories lack mechanisms that can be tested through conventional scientific methods. The survival hypothesis confronts the absence of biographical verification and the linguistic limitations that critics have identified in Jensen's Swedish ability. T herself returned to the quiet domesticity of 1950s Philadelphia, carrying no conscious memory of the Swedish words that had emerged from her unconscious mind. By all accounts, she resumed her life as an ordinary housewife, unmarked by her role in what would become one of the most documented paranormal investigations in academic history. Her husband continued his medical practice, and neither sought publicity or profit from their extraordinary experience. They had simply lived through something that challenged the boundaries of human understanding and then moved forward as if nothing had happened. The tapes continue to rest in the University of Virginia archives, available to any researcher willing to grapple with their implications. Each new generation of linguists, psychologists, and consciousness researchers brings fresh analytical tools to bear on the recordings, yet the fundamental mystery persists unchanged. Jensen's voice continues to speak across the decades, offering fragments of a life that may or may not have existed, in a language that T may or may not have truly understood. In the end, the case returns us to that winter evening in 1955, to the Philadelphia rowhouse that smelled of coffee and floor polish, to the moment when an ordinary hypnosis session revealed the extraordinary possibility that language itself might remember what individual minds cannot. The question they left behind, whether consciousness can transcend the boundaries of individual identity and access knowledge from sources beyond personal experience, refuses to close. In the space between what we can prove and what we cannot explain, Jensen Jacoby waits, speaking Swedish words that continue to echo through the mysteries of human consciousness.